All right, Psalm 45. Let's call this one Forever a Queen. Understanding that this chapter seems to be describing the marriage or a marriage song of a man and his wife, specifically a king and his queen, and not just any king. It seems like it is actually a picture of Christ himself. As it begins, my heart overflows with a pleasing theme. I address my verses to the king, and describing him is going to point out three characteristics in verse 2, verse 4, and verse 6 of his reign, for lack of a better term. You are the most handsome of the sons of men in verse 2, but he's not just a pretty face. It's going to say that grace is poured out on his lips. And as we have studied this passage here before, it's not simply gracious or flattering words. It's basically talking about his ability to encourage those, especially the righteous, who are struggling. Understanding it is going to go on in verse 4 to describe him in his majesty, riding out victoriously for the cause of truth and meekness and righteousness, which is going to come up again. As we look at verse 6, where it's describing his throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of uprightness. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. And likewise, it's going to describe his queen as being somebody who is fit for him, going back to the way in which Adam had Eve created as a helpmeet fit for him. The queen is going to be described in verse 9, going on to verse 10. Hear, O daughter, and consider, incline your ear, forget your people and your father's house. First thing we want to emphasize is the degree to which there are some things she's called to forget. Beyond that, though, in verse 11, she's going to be called to do something that is almost considered a four-letter word, even though it's only got three letters in it. Nowadays, submission is considered to be insulting, but she's going to be called to bow to him, but not for just any reason, because as we go on in verse 13 to see that she is clothed in robes interwoven with gold, and in verse 14 as she is described as being in robes of many colors, being led to the king. Ultimately, it is saying that all of the things that she's being asked to trade in are being traded in exchange for a level of praise that goes on forever. Something that is going to come up in verse 2 when it says that he has been blessed forever, and that in verse 6 his throne is forever. The woman that is fit for him, or the bride that is fit for him, is going to be praised likewise forever. And understanding that even as a single guy, I understand that marriage is one of those things described as forever. One of the worst things, one of the things that we are warned most about as single folks is rushing into a forever commitment with a short-sighted view of what forever actually feels like. Even worse, though, one of the things that we are warned about is going into marriage under the assumption that we are going to be able to fix our spouse, and understand what that meant to me in going back over Psalm 45, where sometimes that is a caution offered to women who are looking to marry a man only to fix him up in the church. Both men and women can be tempted to come into the relationship where we are described as the bride of Christ, hoping to fix Jesus. Understanding that I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that they would be so bold as to try to fix Jesus. On the other hand, the consistent history of God's people from the time they left Egypt to the time that Jesus had his final dispute with the Pharisees was one where they were consistently trying to repurpose what God was asking them to do into a better fit with their interests. And so understanding that forever is an awfully long time to deal with someone who is trying to respin your words into something that's more consistent with their interest, or to deal with someone who is simply flat out trying to turn you or steer you in another direction. Jesus has no interest in spending forever with somebody who's trying to fix him. And so understanding that Psalm 45 seems an awful lot like Revelation 19, a passage describing something called the marriage supper of the Lamb. It seems that at least one of the things that the king and queen have in common is righteousness. Understanding that the robes that she's described as wearing in Psalm 45 are more specifically described as being the righteous deeds of the saints, as it will go on to describe the groom or the rider on the white horse as being called faithful and true, and in righteousness, he judges and makes war. So understand that going back to Psalm 45, when it calls the bride or the queen to one, forget her people and her father's house and bow to him, one of the things that he is calling her to forget is whatever she might have known about righteousness, so he can replace that with an understanding of righteousness that will make her a joy to be around forever.